I have this note here from the researcher who compiled the sources for our deep dive today, and I really just want to read it in the first person because it frames everything we're going to talk about so perfectly.
Right. Yeah.
So they wrote, I am a physician and a forester, and I've spent a long lifetime in western timber towns and farm valleys. I've lived through mill closures, massive land booms, multi-year droughts, and through all of it, I've watched this exact same pattern repeat.
Right.
Whenever a community comes under intense economic stress, the argument over who gets what always becomes the argument over who rules.
It's just such a striking observation, right? And it perfectly frames the mission of this whole deep dive, this multi-part series we're starting today.
Exactly.
Because welcome, by the way, to everyone listening. What we're doing here is testing a massive historical thesis. We want to know, is the tension between capital and labor, the struggle between the people who work and the people who own, is that actually the core engine of economic history?
And, we really want to maintain a measured observer stance here. We're genuinely curious. We're not here to preach this thesis. We are just testing it.
Right. We're going to look at the strongest arguments on all sides, from Karl Marx to Adam Smith, and just see how the evidence stacks up.
But before we jump onto the timeline, I feel like we need to just quickly define the terms we're going to be throwing around, right? Because they guide this whole series.
Definitely. It's so easy to get bogged down in jargon, so let's keep it simple.
Yeah. So first up, we have labor.
Yeah.
And in plain language, that is just human work. It's the time, the effort, the skill you apply to making or doing something.
Right. And then you have capital, which is basically the stored result of past work that you then use to produce more stuff.
So tools, right, or workshops.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tools, land, money, and as we'll see later in some pretty horrific ways, eventually human beings held as property.
And then the third term is surplus, which is really the big one here. Surplus is what production yields beyond what it actually costs to keep the producers alive and working. It's the extra.
It's the profit, basically. The whole fight is always over who gets to keep that surplus.
Right. And finally, the wage. That's just the price of labor when it's bought by the hour or the day, rather than owned outright.
Right. So we have labor, capital, surplus, and wage. And, to really see how societies have tried to balance these things, we have to go back way before the Industrial Revolution.
Way before the factory.
Yeah, long before the factory whistle ever blew. We have to start in the Middle Ages. So roughly the 1100s to the 1300s, because they had to figure out who controlled the work, too.
And their answer was the medieval craft guild.
Exactly. And the guild system set up this very specific labor ladder. So a boy, and it was mostly boys, would bind as an apprentice.
And he's not working for wages at this point, right?
No, not at all. He's working for training. He lives with the master, learns the trade. And then once he graduates, he becomes a journeyman.
Which comes from the French journée, right? Like a day.
Right. So now he's getting paid a daily wage. But that's not the end goal. The ultimate goal is that eventually you accumulate enough capital, and with the guild's explicit permission, you become a master.
So you get your own shop.
You get your own shop, you take on your own apprentices, and you keep the surplus.
It's so fascinating because it's like this bizarre mix of a modern trade school, a labor union, and like a super exclusive country club all rolled into one.
That is a great way to describe it.
Because, the paradox here is that capital and labor weren't two warring camps yet.
Yeah.
They were literally just different stages of one person's life.
At least in theory, yeah. And this is actually the site of a massive fight among modern historians.
Oh, really? Over the guilds?
Oh, a huge dispute. On one side, you have scholars like S.R. Epstein, and he argues that guilds were brilliant. There were these amazing engines of skill transmission that solved a real market failure.
Like how so?
Well, think about it. If you're a master, why would you spend 7 years training a kid who might just take your secrets and open a cheaper shop next door? The guild system protected the master's investment, which meant skills actually got passed down.
Oh, that makes sense. But I'm guessing someone disagrees with that.
Very much so. Sheila Ogilvy, for instance, she's used these massive databases to argue that guilds were basically just rent-seeking cartels.
Cartels, wow.
Yeah. She argues they blocked innovation, they enriched a few insiders, and they actively locked out women, Jewish people, and migrants. It was gatekeeping on a massive scale.
So if it was this tightly controlled hereditary ladder where the insiders held all the power,
yeah,
what actually shattered it? How do you break a system that entrenched?
It takes a literal demographic catastrophe.
The Black Death.
The Black Death.
Yeah.
So from 1347 to 1351, the plague wipes out a huge portion of the European workforce.
Right.
And suddenly, labor becomes incredibly scarce. And the workers who actually survived, they suddenly realize, wait a minute, we have immense leverage here.
Because the lords still need the fields plowed.
Exactly. So wages just surge, workers are demanding way more money, or they're just leaving to go find a lord who will pay them better.
So the surplus is suddenly flowing to the workers.
Right. And the English crown absolutely panics. They intervene, but they intervene completely on the side of the employers.
So they try to put a lid on it.
Yeah, the Statutes of Laborers in 1349 and 1351, they literally try to freeze wages by law. Fast forward to Elizabeth I, and we get the 1563 Statute of Artificers.
Okay, I looked at this document, and it is wild.
It really is. It mandates that justices of the peace have to meet annually to legally set the maximum wages in their area, plus mandatory 7-year apprenticeships and compulsory harvest labor. Like, you had to work the harvest.
And nobody could break a contract early, right? Not the master or the servant.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to push back on this mechanic here. The justices of the peace, the guys setting these maximum wages, weren't they typically the local landowners and employers themselves?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
I mean, that sounds like a massive conflict of interest. That's just capital fully capturing the state to suppress labor, isn't it?
So that is totally the intuitive reading, and I validate that question. But to steelman the other side, some historians argue it wasn't just raw, cynical wage suppression.
How else could you see it?
Well, they argue it was about a paternalist ordering of society, aiming for stability in a really volatile time. And there is evidence that in some places, those assessed rates actually acted as a floor, like a minimum wage, rather than just a ceiling.
Okay, that's fair. But I mean, this whole legal scaffolding, it really only worked when both the labor and the land were stuck together on the island of England.
Right.
So what happens when they discover a whole continent with endless land, but absolutely no labor to work it?
Yeah, that's when we moved to colonial America, the 1600s to the 1770s. England had labor but no land. The colonies had all this stolen land but no labor, so they invented the indenture contract.
And the statistics on this are just staggering. Like, roughly 1/2 to 3/4 of all European immigrants to the mainland colonies arrived this way, right?
Yeah, it was the primary way people got there. By the 1770s, something like 96% of these servants were being shipped directly to the Chesapeake area for the tobacco fields.
They were basically selling 4 to 7 years of their physical labor just for a transatlantic ticket.
Exactly.
I was thinking about this, and the best analogy I can come up with for the listeners, imagine taking out a brutal student loan just to buy a plane ticket, but the collateral you put up is your actual physical freedom for half a decade.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really grim way to put it, but it's accurate. Though we do need to clarify the reality of that contract. It was an intermediate case.
Right, because they weren't slaves.
Exactly. They received what were called freedom dues at the end of their term. Tools, maybe some land, clothes. But during those 4 to 7 years, their labor was absolute property.
It could be bought and sold.
Bought, sold, bequeathed in wills, they could be whipped. And if you ran away, the courts would literally just add years to your contract as a punishment.
But then, after 1650 or so, wages back in England started to improve, right?
Yeah, the economy in England stabilized, so the supply of people desperate enough to sign these indenture contracts just dried up.
But the colonies still demanded that surplus. They needed cheap labor for the cash crops. So they turned to a much darker, much more permanent solution.
Yes. And we need to treat this section plainly and soberly, because this is chattel slavery in America. This is the absolute limit case of the thesis we're testing today.
Where the human being is converted entirely into capital.
Completely. And just to lay out the raw data, using the Slave Voyages database, which is kind of the gold standard for this, we're looking at 12.5 million Africans embarked on slave ships.
God.
And roughly 388,000 were disembarked in mainland North America. And by the 1860 census, through natural increase and forced reproduction, that population was nearly 4 million enslaved people.
And what's so chilling is how methodically the law was used to build this. Like Virginia's 1662 law that made slavery heritable through the mother.
Right, partus sequitur ventrum.
Exactly. Capital literally giving birth to more capital. And it didn't stop there. They used modern financial instruments, mortgages, life insurance policies, all applied to human beings.
It was a fully financialized system. By 1860, this human capital was valued at around $3 billion.
$3 billion, that's just staggering. But how did the colonial elites even justify that transition? Like, how did they go from temporary indentured servants to permanent racialized chattel slavery?
So this is a major historical dispute, and it often centers on Edmund Morgan's famous thesis about Bacon's Rebellion in 1676.
What was Bacon's Rebellion?
It was this moment in Virginia where poor white laborers and enslaved black laborers actually allied together and rebelled against the wealthy elite.
Oh, wow. So like a unified class uprising.
Precisely. And Morgan argues that the colonial elites were so terrified by this alliance that they purposely turned to racialized slavery to permanently fracture the working class.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. Give the poor whites just enough privilege to make sure they never ally with black laborers again.
That sounds incredibly plausible.
Mhm.
Is there pushback on that?
Lots of pushback. Critics argue that Morgan focuses too much on this elite conspiracy. They say, look at the supply curves. The supply of indentured servants dropped, and the Atlantic slave trade made captive Africans more readily available.
So they argue it's just brutal market mechanics.
Right, demographic shifts and supply chains. Also, just as a side note, while that $3 billion valuation is generally accepted, some historians do argue about whether it was technically the largest asset in America, depending on how you run the math on land values.
That makes sense. But either way, slavery proved the compiler's framing perfectly, right? Whoever controls the surplus controls the government.
Totally. The slave codes, the armed patrols, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, the government was built to protect that capital.
But as that system expanded, it eventually ran headfirst into a completely different vision of labor that was brewing up in the North.
Right, because the Southern pro-slavery advocates had this thing called the mudsill theory.
The mudsill theory.
The idea was that every advanced society fundamentally needs a permanent, subordinated lower class, a mudsill, to do all the dirty work so the upper class can build civilization.
Well, that is dark. But the antebellum North had a massive ideological counterattack to that, right?
They did, the free labor ideology.
Actually, I have a quote here from Abraham Lincoln. This is from his first annual message in 1861, and he says, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital, and deserves much the higher consideration."
It's such a powerful quote, and historian Eric Foner has written a lot about this free labor ideal. The whole concept was based on social mobility.
Like the medieval ladder again.
Very similar. The northern ideal was that a man works for wages temporarily, saves his surplus, and then eventually becomes an independent proprietor. He buys his own farm or his own blacksmith shop.
Right, and I have to raise this point to you, the listener, because it's the critical flaw in this whole beautiful 1861 ideal. It entirely assumes that wage work is a temporary phase.
Yes, exactly.
So what happens when the Industrial Revolution fully hits? The textile factories open, the steel mills fire up. Becoming your own boss and owning a massive factory just isn't a realistic option for 99% of people.
And that is the exact tension that sets the stage for the rest of this series, because right when the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, ending our limit case of human beings as capital, the industrial factory age begins.
Wow.
Millions of people are suddenly locked into permanent wage labor with no real hope of ever owning the shop.
So just to recap this crazy journey we've been on today, we went from the guild ladder, where you graduate into capital, to the state legally capping wages after the Black Death.
Right.
Then we saw the temporary unfreedom of indentured servants, the terrible absolute limit case of chattel slavery. And finally, Lincoln's free labor ideal right before it collides with industrialization.
Which leaves us with the big open question for everyone listening, the question we're testing in this whole deep dive.
What's the verdict so far?
Looking at this timeline, is this brutal struggle between capital and labor truly the main engine of economic history? Or is it just one force among many, alongside geography or technology or mutual cooperation?
That is the big question. We aren't going to answer it today, but as we prepare to enter the factory age in our next episode, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
Lay it on us.
If capital and labor are fundamentally locked in a battle over who gets the surplus, what happens when capital eventually figures out how to bypass the wage negotiation entirely and just replace human labor with machines?
Oof, yeah, that changes everything.
Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.